Welcome everyone to another one of our presentations on avoiding food waste. So in this presentation there's going to be a few actions that might involve a little bit of aroma, a little bit of smell that may not be quite so pleasant, and a little bit of sorting through and getting your hands messy. So bear with me, and we might be valuable in thinking that this is not smell-o-vision. Nonetheless, let's take a backtrack. So we're here today to avoid food waste. So we definitely want to avoid it, but the reality is we're probably more talking about minimising it, because there are items such as mandarins, such as eggs, that come in shells and peels that we don't traditionally eat. So we can avoid as much as we can, and then if you remember our waste hierarchy tree, we're really about minimising. So you will get some food waste, is where I'm going with this. But what I want you to do, and this is a little bit of a different take on the whole concept of food waste, I want you to see that as an asset. I don't want you to see it as a negative thing. I want you to see it as a really positive thing, because it's really got some great advantages if you manage it properly. You can create soil, you can create all sorts of things that are great remedies for you and for the garden. So there's lots of things you can do as long as you manage it right. So this presentation today is really about managing the food waste that you do end up with, the food scraps that you do end up with. And remember, if we think about what actually is food waste. So our food waste might be the bits and pieces that we've cut off the vegetable components that we don't eat, or the fruit components that we don't eat. Our food waste might be the leftovers that didn't get eaten in the back of the fridge. Our food waste might be the leftover bits and pieces that sort of come as a packaging, like the oils and things off feta, or it might be some of the onion peel. Okay, so those sorts of components are typically our food waste. They might also be, as for some of the other presentations, that little thing that you forgot that's in the back of the pantry or the freezer that's past its use by date. So those sorts of things, again, make our food waste up. So this presentation is going to help you think about how you can manage those particular components of food waste that you now are going to see as an asset. Because remember, they truly are an asset. You've actually bought them. You've actually paid money or spent time on making them or getting them. So they are an asset. It's just all about how to manage it. Certainly as part of my journey, I've learnt lots of things and also continue to learn. And I hope that you're in that frame of mind too, that there's a journey that we all go on where there's lots of learning components, some of which are related to you at that time and others you pass by. Maybe today, some of those things you'll take on and have a go in your own house. So I'm really just sharing those experiences that I've had with you in the hope that maybe they too will be applicable to you. Okay, remember, we've got to do a little bit of revision before we get stuck into why this blue piece of plastic is on the bench. A little bit of revision, thinking about why. Why do we want to prevent food waste? Well, if we go to our big picture and little picture scenario, and for some of you who've been watching these presentations all the way through, you could almost learn this from me by now. So the little picture is very much about how you as an individual, not how, but rather why you as an individual should prevent food waste. So it saves you money, it saves you time, and there's a really strong possibility that you'll eat healthier because you're using the items that you have and you've thought about what meals you're going to create to maximise these ingredients. It might be a glut of cauliflowers in your garden that you're growing. Whatever it is, those ingredients, you'll think about how you can use them in a healthier context, just because you've put that extra planning and thought. So we're also thinking about preventing food waste for bigger reasons than ourselves. And those bigger reasons than ourselves are very much preventing food waste for big community reasons, big planet benefit reasons. So they might be things like healing our broken food system. which today traditionally is quite linear. And with some of the practice and the strategies that we're talking about in this presentation that involve preventing food waste, we can work really hard to make it much more circular, meaning that all the entities involved have that perpetuity and continue to be involved rather than having those resources disappear outside of the system. We also, by not wasting our food, we show that we're respecting the people who have produced it, as well as the people who are involved in all of that food chain. We're respecting their efforts and respecting the resources that it took to actually produce and obtain them. The water, the air, the clean soil, all of those are very much big assets that we're showing that respect to. But you know, we're also thinking of the future generations. We're thinking of those people who will have certain needs. And by not taking too much and by using what we do take in a really considered and compassionate manner, we're actually showing a respect for the future generations and their needs as well. I see all of these as fantastic reasons to avoid food waste. We have also, as part of that knowledge of understanding of resources, we're also ensuring that the resources that we are using are being really well applied, recycled, reapplied, reused, wherever we possibly can. I think that's a great reason to prevent food waste, or, as we said, to at least minimise it. Okay, so why do I have this blue sheet on the bench? One of the things that's really important at my restaurant is to minimise or reapply any food waste that we get. So all of our organics are all reapplied. Nothing goes into landfill at all. And I'll explain the intricacies of that as we go along. But last night, I've kept the bucket of scraps, which would normally go to my chooks, so just to show you. So you'll see some of the scraps from the restaurant here. So let's pour them onto this sheet, and hopefully they all stay on this sheet. We don't really want to move them beyond that. This beautiful kitchen here. So let's see what else we've got in here. There's a little bit of pizza, lots of eggshells, a bit of pasta. What else? A little bit more pasta, a little bit of pizza, a few more eggshells. I think we can probably leave it at that as it starts to get a bit liquidy at the bottom. Okay, so there's a few lettuce leaves, some parsley stems. Let's spread that out a little bit so you can see what's in there. So there's some of the scraps from the restaurant last night. Now, one of the strategies that we have at the restaurant is where we encourage people to take with them what they can't eat. So I must admit, in terms of scraps, we get very few. We also make as much as we can from its origin ingredients. So again, that means we have limited packaging, and we also, because we're using those origin ingredients, we have very limited sorts of scraps as well. Okay, so let us categorise what we actually have, shall we? So I'm going to move some of these scraps into some piles. Let's see what we can do here. Let's put something here. So I have a tag here, garden useful. I'm going to give the garden useful some of the eggshells. Some compost. I think we might put some of the lettuce and some of there's a leftover bit of capsicum there into some compost. I've got one here called pets. We might put that with this piece of pizza, although I'm a bit dubious about that. We'll think about that one. We might be able to. We might also put some of those lettuce leaves on perhaps that one. And I've got another compost label. So we can probably group those together with some old parsley. Maybe we could put those in there. And garden useful, perhaps let's put one of those with some of the stem of broccoli and a few more pieces of capsicum in there and some of the mushrooms. Let's put that, actually we'll focus on the capsicum, put those in there. Okay, there we are. There's some categories which will show you that what we can do is we can very much separate this. So when we were at the restaurant, we've just put all of those scraps into the one bucket. That's because when I take them, my first port of call out of the restaurant is to actually go and put them in a big bay in my chook yard, and the chooks scratch them through, and then from there I take them out of that bay and take them to the compost. But to be honest, I'm not going to elaborate on that because I'm going to talk to you about that more so in the next presentation. What I want to focus on today in our management of scraps presentation for today is much more practicing management strategies that apply to small spaces. So you might not have a backyard, you might not have a big space in which to compost. Consequently, we need to work out strategies. How do we manage our scraps in order to be able to live in that smaller environment? What are our options? What do we do? So let's have a look into that and see how we can manage each individual group from there. Okay, so we're at our zone, we've looked at our scraps, we've grouped them into certain categories. Let's have a look at each one of those categories in just a moment, because what I'm going to encourage you is to think about the management of these scraps in your small space. And to be able to do that, you really need to segregate and divide these individual scraps out before they go in there. So before they go into one collection bucket. So it may involve you really being quite clever about the containers that you source to be able to put the different scraps in. So I'm holding this see-through plastic bucket, relatively small. Now what I'm going to encourage some things to think about. The size of the scrap bucket is important. It's important that you be able to manage that before it gets smelly, before it gets all yuck. So if you have a really big bucket, you wait until that's full. It may be way too long before that starts to decompose and become something you just don't want to deal with. So you need to think about the size of the container. The other thing I think is important is to make sure that it's actually see-through, so that if, for example, you have several people in your house and they don't know what goes in there, even though you've labelled it, they can look in and see, oh, that's where the bread goes. Oh, that's where that goes. That's where the eggshells go. That's where the citrus, the onion go. And so consequently, they also can visually trigger what goes in there. A lid that seals, also a good plan. So I find those buckets quite useful, but I must admit probably my pentultimate, my favourite, let's leave it at that word. I don't think of the other one, I think I made up. My favourite container for my scraps is this stainless steel bucket. It also has a lid, and I just have to share with you how I came across these. So there was a hospital at Bunyip down in Gippsland where I happened to be born, and they closed the hospital down, and so a lot of their stainless steel bits and pieces they got rid of really as part of their closing of the hospital. Consequently, I ended up with these, and these were some of the sterilised buckets that all the sterilised equipment went into. So I love this. This is from the hospital I was born, and I now use it for scraps. This bucket is fantastic. I don't expect you to necessarily have a stainless steel one, but certainly any steel buckets are great because they don't absorb odour, and they don't scratch, and they don't necessarily have all the tainting that a plastic container does. So maybe a steel bucket might work for managing some of your scraps. Whatever you can access is something that you'll be able to manage that suits your household. So just make sure that you've got household sensitivities in place when you think about the type of storage container that you have. All right, now let's look at our categories, shall we? So garden useful. if we're talking about garden useful, a lot of the scraps have got a range of really useful elements to them, and I'll show you. What I typically do is separate out the eggshells from our scraps. So that's part of my management strategy. So I keep the eggshells separate for a couple of reasons. One reason is, in a garden context, snails and slugs do not like the protein membrane layer that's just inside the eggshell. So when the eggshell is relatively fresh, it means that must emit an odour that they just do not like. However, once it gets wet and rained on, that odour must dissipate over about 3 or 4 days, because the snails and slugs will re-enter that zone. Until then, however, your eggshells are a great protective element. They're also fantastically high in calcium, which means that you can add them irrespective of the avoiding snails and slugs to your garden, and make sure that there's an extra calcium supply to condition the soil. And so what I do, keep them in a bucket in the kitchen, and they don't smell. And in the kitchen is really important, because what I want to have happen is they all dry and they crush beautifully. So it's really good fun crushing them all up. And then they crush into small pieces. And as you know from surface area to volume ratio chemistry type stuff, that the pieces, the smaller they are, the more quickly they break down and the more accessible they then become to all the critters in your soil. So keeping them dry, keeping them in the kitchen so you can easily just designate your eggshells to that space is a great way of managing that. So consequently, from our array of scraps here, those eggshells are very, very garden useful and worthy of segregating, and so managing your scraps that way. Okay, avoidable. Now I've probably got these a little bit uncertain, but more than likely those lettuce leaves there could have been consumed right back when the lettuce was being prepared. Mix it in with some of the younger leaves, some of the older leaves are probably quite edible. If you're having them raw, it might be dubious, but you can also eat warm lettuce. So the older leaves are great sautéed or put through a casserole, and they behave very similar to a spinach in that way. So that I've put in the avoidable category, along with the parsley. Again, avoidable scraps we didn't need. We could have used that parsley before it started to discolour and age. So we just haven't abided by the shelf life of that product in that instance. We'll take that pizza piece out, because that's not really avoidable. Unless someone just, wasn't hungry. I mean, could have been more hungry. The pets category. So this is a really challenging one for me. I certainly have a view, as I've indicated, I would take these scraps and feed them to my chooks. They don't get them long term, so they only have them to squash through and scatter through for perhaps 24, 48 hours before I then gather the scraps up again and move them on. But in your context, and again, it's up to you, see how you feel, there could be consideration for feeding scraps like old pieces of pizza or some raw dog bones, or maybe some pasta in here, to maybe your dog or your cat. I'm not overly comfortable with it, but that's a decision you would need to make. I feel you need to then definitely consider a balanced diet for your animal. And I know from experience, I have a few goats, that goats just do not, their digestive systems are not used to coping with all the oils and the fats that we typically have in our diets, and particularly with these types of scraps. High carbohydrate, lots of oils and fats, it doesn't do good things for them. So I'm not convinced that pets should be eating many of these scraps. I see value in dogs eating raw bones, particularly larger bones, but I'm not sure that, I don't have exposure to that type of scraps. If you do, that's a decision you'll be able to make for yourself. So this one, I've got another garden useful. We had our eggshells as garden useful over there. We've got capsicum as garden useful here. Now, I've put this capsicum under garden useful because there's a fantastic asset category in that lots of our scraps you can actually grow more vegetables from. And I think we don't do enough of this. It's so cool and so much fun. Particularly if you have things like the top of a carrot and you've cut the top off, just use the remaining part of the root. That top bit, when you put it in a little saucer of water, will grow new little shoots. And those new little shoots are fantastically edible. So, you know, carrot top pesto, carrot top parsley, all of those different foliages, all that foliage can make all sorts of different recipes. It's a fantastic start. And similar with capsicum, so there's seeds, there's pumpkin seeds, there's, if you've got apples, apple core seeds, a whole lot of seeds go into our scraps. And again, great starting a garden from those. So think about what's going into your scrap bucket that you might actually be able to grow a garden from or grow more food from. Imagine that. This is just a whole new way of thinking about your food scraps. And particularly again, as we're focused on small spaces, those things that you're growing can usually be grown in a saucer on the windowsill, and you'll arrive at quite good value from them. Chives, alliums, so all of the onion family, again, another really good one to grow more food from those scraps. Okay, let's go back to this one, compost. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about compost in the next presentation, which is that big space when you've got the zone. But what I want to talk about, how, you know, you've got these scraps which you've identified through your scrap management system as being compostable. Great, but you've only got a little small space. What are you going to do? What options have you got here? Well, you have got options, and that's where, you know, just an awareness might be working out what suits you in your household. So let's look at the options. Let me just reach down the bench down here. Okay, so this looks a bit rural, probably because it is a bit rural. You may have heard of a composting style called bokashi. So this is a bucket that I've actually made up using all sorts of found bits at home. I've put a tap down the bottom down here, and inside it's got a grate that the scraps sit on. And most importantly, this is a really tight sealing lid. I'll just pop it down there so I can use my hands. As you may have gathered, I sort of kind of need hands to talk with. So bokashi, you can put all your compostable scraps in a bokashi bin. And what happens is very different style of breakdown of those scraps compared to compost. So the bokashi bin, you could imagine this sitting on your kitchen bench over to one side, a lot cleaner than this is because I did retrieve it from the garage. And what the process of bokashi is, you purchase, they look like sawdust, but they're actually got little lactobacillus inoculum on like sawdust. You purchase some of those and they're really reasonably priced. Mostly, you might find them in most hardware stores. And so you mix your scraps. So the way you'd set it up is you'd put a layer of scraps, handful of bokashi, layer of scraps, handful of bokashi. And that might happen over a couple of weeks. And so you progressively fill your bucket. Now the way the science behind all this work, bokashi is a fermentation breakdown. Now you might be getting scared because this is a word that's typically associated with cooking. But, which it is, the process is the same. So if you're good at fermenting, you'll be fantastic at bokashi. So what happens is in a low oxygen environment, the bacteria all work on all the nutrients that are in the food and they break it down. And as a consequence of their breaking it down and consuming it, they actually produce acids and alcohol, which create an environment where decomposition is almost ceased. So moisture leaves the particular scraps, which is why I had a tap on the bottom, so you get liquid off the bottom, and then you end up with all of those scraps all similar style, like they're still there, but they've all sort of shrunken a little bit, given way a little bit of texture, so they've become quite flaccid. And as a consequence, what you end up with is a smaller volume of scraps, which can really easily be dug into the ground and just fill them in with a hole. So you get the liquid off that you can water your pot plants with. Dilute it down, always important to dilute that. Water the pot plants with it as like a soil conditioner, and then you get all this sort of smaller volume of scraps that can be dug in, and that disappears in the ground really quite quickly when compared to if you just put the food scraps in there straight away. So bokashi has enormous value in a small space because you end up having less volume of scraps, and you can also do it inside with relatively little aroma. If you are getting aroma and if it's the liquid's not giving way, maybe you might need to rethink your volume of scraps in relation to ratio of bokashi that you add. So you may need to experiment a bit with that, and that will be in relation to how nutrient dense some of your scraps are. So you might have to have different playing with that. Your household will determine what sort of scraps you have, and what you put in there will determine how much bokashi. Read the instructions, have a play, be guided by it. If it goes wrong, tip that out, bury it, start again. Okay, so that's certainly one option. Another option is, I'm not sure if you've heard of a share waste program, but it's a website that you can go into and log on to, and you get your bucket of scraps, and the compostable ones, the ones that you can't see as being a totally valuable asset. But often what you'll be able to do is take them to an indicated place on the website. You set up a meeting, and they might just swap you back some compost. So you say, here's my scraps, and they give you the compost. What a perfect arrangement. Someone else is doing that composting for you, and you're giving them the origin or the asset with which to make more. So yes, it may mean you need to ride your push bike around the town with a basket full of scraps on the front. Don't feel ashamed, because you are helping the circular economy in your household to develop. You are creating those actual assets out of those scraps. So definitely don't be ashamed. It's a great thing that you're doing. So there's two options with which how you can deal with your scraps. Certainly the first thing is manage them. Get some buckets. Make sure that you can divide them all up into different categories. There's some scraps missing from here that I just want to make quick mention of. One of them is onions. So onion peel and onion offcuts, so the tops and tails, can certainly be steamed or cooked down, and then they can be added to compost. Or you may decide to help add flavour to your stocks. You can put the onion skins in a stock, and you can take them out at the end if you're feeling, again, that's a way of cooking them down, and again, they can be added to the compost. Citrus is another one that people say is often problematic, and if you make your own fresh juices, you may end up with a lot of citrus peel. A great way to deal with that one is to actually put them collectively in a bucket with a little bit of water. I wouldn't leave this one inside because it might be a little bit too aromatic, but as they start to break down, they create quite a slush, and they give off the oils that are in their skins, which are usually the biggest problem. And then that can actually be tipped onto the garden. Fantastic for deterring snails and slugs again. And it again, once it's all a slush, it will break down, but it does have a bit of aroma, so maybe not keeping it inside. The other ones that are problematic are avocado pips and avocado skins, so the peel of the avocado. What I would suggest you do with the peel of the avocado is get your scissors out, cut all the avocado up into little pieces, and then it can be included in your compost. It does have a few chemicals in it which are not the ideal, but if cutting it into small pieces, it helps the microorganisms deal with that in a small bites. So that over a greater time they can break it down. The pips also are not, they also have the same sort of not so pleasant chemicals in them. They're certainly not good for chooks. So what you should do with your avocado pips is to actually soak them in some water, and that'll take a lot of that chemical out. Cut it up into pieces, and it too can go into the compost. Oils can be added, oils and cooked bones can be added into your bokashi bin. So there's another really good reason for having a bokashi bin. And other than that, most of the scraps that are organic can pretty much be added to a compost. Okay, so all these organic materials that I've got here, there's some aspects not well represented as well. So meat, for example, I have this little piece of bacon. So that can go in small quantities, that can go in your compost bin, so in your compost collection. In larger quantities, however, it is a bit more problematic. So you may choose to put some of the scraps in the freezer if you've got a lot at once, freeze them and just take sections out and put them gradually in a compost bin. Or if you're in a share waste system, you may decide to actually tell the people that you're doing the share waste with that you've got them, and you may decide to eke them into the system, or whether they can cope with a lot of meat at once. Similarly, if we go back to the pet issue, again with the meat, you may find that you can give them small quantities of some meat scraps, never big ones. I'm very hesitant about feeding people food. So apart from that, I think we've got most of those different scrap types covered. The most important thing is for you to decide how to manage those particular scrap types. So those containers we talked about before, one of them that you may need or you may be encouraged to use is what they call a FOGO bin. A lot of the shires and councils encourage you to use them, and they are versions of this sort of container. The FOGO bin concept is certainly that the shires and the councils have got their big compost. So we've got our options as we've got bokashi, we've got share waste, and now you've got disposal through your local shire or councils using their FOGO bin. So those FOGO bins can handle pretty much anything in them. As far as I know, they keep all the banana peels, the oils, the meat, the bones, and the green compost all in that FOGO bin. So you can send that off to the shire, which means you don't have to deal with it. My only hesitation there is that you're sending your asset away with no direct reward. So don't forget, you've bought these things. Yes, you've minimised your food waste, avoided it where possible, and now if you select and categorise your food waste into groups, huge asset benefit to you by working out what you can reuse and reapply before you end up with your little limited amount of compost that may need to go to either one of those three systems. Fantastic. So let's just review. So let's do some actions. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do is to sort of kind of take a look at your food waste and think about categorising as I've done. Next thing is to find some containers so you can manage it, so that your family also know how to manage it, where to put the scraps. Once you've got that management in place, then you know how to deal with each particular category of food scrap. And then if it's the compost one and you haven't got space, you know how to place that. If it's the avoidable one, you've got options, similar for the garden useful ones. And the garden useful ones might be the eggshells, the citrus, banana peels, might be some onion. They're all very valuable ones, not to mention the ones you can grow extra food from. Fantastic. So I think I'll just double check. Last thing I just want to encourage you to think about is all of this goes toward making dirt. So I'd like to encourage you, if you have got space for a compost, to check out the next presentation where we talk way more about composting. We might get a little bit dirtier, but it will still be fun and hopefully a bit of informative as well. Thank you very much for your time today. Have a go at those actions, And I'd like to thank the sponsors and those filming, and we'll certainly cross paths again. Thank you.